Creativity and the elements of art. By being aware of all of the elements of art, we can become more creative. It's important to ask ourselves, how do elements of an image make us think? This painting is by the American artist Andrew Wyeth. He is trying to tell us that there is something important about this girl. What do you think it is? Why is she crawling in the field below the house? Would it change your perspective if I told you she was blind? Why she is there and how she'll find home is for you to decide, but the image couldn't intrigue us without the use of certain things. And so the artist has been creative with line, shape, color, value, texture, and space to do this. In this lesson, we will visit these 6 big ideas to help you on your journey to creativity. They are all called the elements because they show up physically in all art, regardless of culture, language, and time. You can start to recognize all of these things. They show up almost all the time. We discussed 7 other principles or ideas also in another lesson that are related. But I want you to remember the 4 eyes of creativity: imagination, incubation, intuition, and invention. If you're going to use these elements to help you with the 4 eyes, you will find more satisfaction in your art projects. The next element of art is line. What would art be like without lines? Lines are so important, actually, to the way our brain works. We would struggle to be creative without it. I doubt that we'd be very productive at all. But why? It's because we use them as the basis for invention and almost everything we design before manufacturing. Or even our written language would suffer, right? Whenever you want to get an idea across to someone, you typically either talk about it or else you have to draw it out. A picture's worth 1,000 words. Essentially, there are 2 kinds of lines: straight and curved. They can be any length. Otherwise, lines that connect are usually considered shapes, which will be another element. And lines regularly change. They they create patterns. Lines can show the illusion of depth with shadows and linear space. Lines can imply texture and they can symbolize things in the real world, or they can even represent certain ideas, like in written language. We're really dependent on the way that we think about lines. When we talk about what lines really are, my opinion is that they are simply a human invention. We can have a caveman somewhere inside of us that we recognize that's when we invented lines. We started making tools to make marks on cave walls. And now these days, they show up on papers and we create them on computers. Sometimes we see them in nature, but are they usually they're usually thin shadows or strings of colors. Nature doesn't think in lines necessarily. Our brain basically says or translates, if I had to recreate that thing in nature, it would be a line, and it's all because of the tools we invented, like pencils and paintbrushes. What really is interesting about lines is how they change our perceptions. Consider the quality of different kinds of lines. This means how thick or thin they are, and if they are diminishing or vanishing. Let's look at some examples. I always loved the Transformers because of their dynamics and how they change. From a coloring book, we can see how intricate this scene is. How many different qualities of line can you see there? In some ways, it's so full of thick and thin lines that we get lost in the details. Just incidentally, there aren't a lot of curved lines here. I like how the artists used the very thinnest lines to push back the buildings and make them appear farther in the background, and then bold lines for things up close. Makes them stand out. You should learn how to draw, maybe by mimicking different styles of lines, though, used by professional artists. Another of my favorites is Calvin and Hobbes. In this comic, Calvin is a dinosaur, and his mom is making him a Triceratops sandwich. Notice how the artist used lines to create the qualities of texture and shadows on the T Rex. And also notice that there are very few straight lines here. You'll learn a lot about lines as you begin to use them for different functions. The next element is shapes. Shapes or forms can make or break a good design. Knowing them allows us to redesign and even imitate things from nature and makes our lives easier. There is a major division, though, for shapes, and that's here geometric and organic. Let's look at organic shapes. These are often curvilinear in appearance. They are similar to those found in nature, such as water, rocks, paisleys, sand waves, animals, camouflage, and plants. Incidentally, these can either be two dimensional or three dimensional. Geometric shapes are shapes based on mathematical principles. They're human made, human invented, such as squares, circles, and triangles. All these shapes are incidentally two dimensional, so it's important to also know the names for three dimensions or form. We call them form when we start working, like in ceramics, pottery, and sculpture. There are many other interesting forms not pictured here, but here are some of those three dimensional forms: cubes, pyramids, spheres, and cylinders are just a few. Lastly, sometimes it's useful to break up or combine shapes and forms so that we can invent new things. So I call this quality open and closed shapes or forms. So the full shape is closed, but by combining or opening up their boundaries, we can we can create new things to help us in life. The third element is color. What would the world be like without color? A black and white world would be far less interesting. So let's talk about how to use colors. And as a side note, this is about mixing paints, not mixing colored lights like on a computer screen. That'll come with more training. The color wheel is made up of hues. That means that the purest colors that we can make are not tinted, toned, or shaded. What do those mean? If we tint a color, then we add white. If we tone a color, we add gray. And what do you think we add if we shade a color? Black is the right answer. So these are pure hues on the color wheels without being shaded. To invent the color wheel, at some time artists had to discover the three basic colors from nature that we could mix to create any other colors. And I bet you know the term for the first three colors. The primary colors are mixed to make a secondary color. And then mixing secondary or primary colors can give us a tertiary color or a third color. And ultimately, remixing, if you wanted to use the right side of the color wheel, the warm colors and or the cool colors on the left, that could darken a painting, or if you mixed the lighter, it would lighten a painting. I like you to begin using color schemes in your artwork. So we will talk about several of them now. This practice will help you see combinations that are predictable and almost always work to get people's attention, and we don't get confused by too many colors. This first color scheme is monochromatic. This is when we just use one color, but the whole picture is made up of tinting, toning, and shading it. It creates a very interesting look, and you should try it sometime. Complementary colors are useful if you just want two colors in a project. You'll find that sport logos use them all the time. To find complementary colors, look straight across the color wheel at any two colors, just like this blue violet and yellow orange. Those go well together. Or analogous colors are another way to use two or three colors together. Analogous means they're alike. It's made with right next to each other on the color wheel, like this blue, green, green, and yellow, green. Let's also try using another set of complementary colors, say red and green, but instead of taking the green, we take two to the other to the sides of the green, like this. We call it a split complementary color. It works it works this way anywhere on the color wheel. I think you'll enjoy using it. Another useful scheme is to take any three colors equal distance apart, like this triangle, spaced three colors in between each. Any combination is a triadic scheme. Well, you could also use this in a square over the wheel, any placement with two colors in between them, and this makes a tetradic color scheme. Altogether, with these tools, you can always make an impact just by using one, two, or three, or four colors. The next element is value. Why do we really need values or lights and darks in an artwork? Well, without them, we would have difficulty with depth perception or seeing the difference between things. Altogether, values create contrast enough to divide up shapes and objects. One of my favorite artists, Sandy Skoglund, plays around with contrast to make things appear and disappear. I took a photo of this installation before I ever even knew what was going on behind me. You can count the gray foxes back there. How many do you see? Probably about 10, right? Well, is there any other fox there? There is a red fox right by my right hand. Do you see it? The artist is using value to get us to think about things in hiding and draw our attention to the gray foxes. The human eye is capable of seeing around 30 shades of gray between black and white. But let's simplify them on this scale with just 9. Which grabs which gray do you think closest matches that fox in the foreground? I'd say it's about a number 6. You can control the contrast of your drawings just by how light or dark you shade them and what will stand out. When we shade three-dimensional forms like these, we need to identify where values are made. You'll pay attention to the light source first. Where's the light supposed to come from? Is it coming from the top? Is it somewhere on the right? Look at the highlights. They're on the left. That's your first clue. And the cast shadows are on the right. So our light source has to be somewhere on the left. Paying attention to the subtle changes of value is especially important when shading things like portraits or even some landscapes. Texture is our next element. What would life be like without texture? I think straight up boring, maybe slippery and cold too. Understanding how to use texture will lead to make things more realistic looking in a painting or a drawing. In terms of two-dimensional work, we can divide up texture into two camps. That's actual and implied texture. Implied means that we have to simulate it or else invent something altogether different. It's an illusion that you create, and it certainly won't say your drawing or painting wouldn't feel like it looks. On the other hand, you can expect to be able to touch the actual texture because it feels like it or looks like it. Both of them are often simulated in art. Here's a start at introducing some different textures, but there's so much more to discover. Reproducing these often comes down to how you make marks, highlights, shadows, like we talked about with the elements of value. One pitfall people make is mistaking pattern for texture. Pattern is a principle of art, similar, but we'll talk about it when we talk about it as a principle of art. It's repetitious, and we'll see some differences later. When you start observing and perceiving different textures and creating that illusion in your art, it will begin to show more sensitivity. The final element of art is space. All art has to deal with space in some way, whether it's the bounds of an exhibition space, or the borders of a canvas, or even how large or small the artist wants to make something. One major division we must always pay attention to is positive and negative space. There are so many other ways to identify the use of positive and negative space, but let's look at how M.C. Escher used the space with the geese here, the black geese, to create a shape of a fish. It goes from negative space shapes in the sky to positive space below. The positive space of geese at the top turn into negative space at the bottom and are lost. On another note, linear perspective is also a major tool for artists. Perspective uses a horizon line, also thought of as an eye level, and it uses transversal lines for straight up and down, orthogonal lines that are always directed back to the vanishing points. These vanishing points determine the illusion of forms on a flat surface, and there can be many vanishing points depending on the composition. Here are two vanishing points where the illusion of the space up front dictates there are no actually literal right angles in this drawing, although we conceive of that box having right angles. Also, here's an image using three vanishing points with similar features. Other important features about perspective can be seen in landscapes, like features about overlapping. You can see the trees overlapping, diminishing sizes, getting smaller, diminishing proximity. That means they start to get kind of closer together as they get farther back. And diminishing details or contrast, they get lighter as they go back and appear farther away.